Hi, my name is Lynn Thompson, and I teach history. I know what you're thinking. History. What an incredibly boring subject. I know, I had to sit in those classes too. Because let's be real, history is about a bunch of dead people. And there are few things as boring as dead people. But there's a few things you need to know about me. Number one, I don't normally look like I look right now. I never wear a coat, and I never wear a tie. And I rarely wear a white shirt because I want to make history come to life. I want to make history something special for my students. Now, it's not that I don't like occasionally dressing up, but I mean, I really dress up. I'll put on a character and the costume of that character from a time long ago. And I'll change my voice and I'll give it an accent for one purpose: to make history exciting. Because when you're one of my students, I want this to be your favorite class. When I come to class every day, I'm coming here to have fun. I know most of you just hanging out because you have to, but no. I come to have fun. And what I really like to do is to act, to jump around a stage and to put on costumes and to become somebody else. And while I'm doing that, I am going to drag you along the trail of history. And you may not realize it, but you're probably going to enjoy it. And you're also going to learn a whole lot about history. Why do we study history? I mean, they make you study it in school. High school, they make you study it. College, they make you study it. Just about every year, you've got to study history of some type or form. Why? Somebody thought it was incredibly important. Somebody thought it was so important that they forced you to take it. A bunch of dead people that lived hundreds, thousands of years ago. Somebody thinks that's important for you to know. How they lived, what they did, how it affects you, how it could affect your future. I want to tell you a little story. There was this pilot during the Second World War. And he was on a torpedo run, attacking enemy ships, and it didn't go well. The plane was ripped apart by anti-aircraft fire, and he had to bail out. The other person in the plane with him didn't make it and was killed. This very young 20-year-old pilot jumps out of the airplane. His parachute opens and he drifts down into the water. He inflates his raft, climbs in, and sits. And on one side is the Japanese fleet. And he can see his comrades flying over to bomb them. And overhead he can see the Japanese aircraft flying over as well. And he gets to sit and contemplate and think about death and war in a front row seat. His name was George Bush. He later became the President of the United States. Now, he got to experience history from the front row. He couldn't escape it. It was his time, his place, in a war that was to be fought with his generation. Well, old George went to college. George graduates. George becomes a businessman. Oil. Is he going to use history? Probably not. George gets into politics. Goes to Congress. Is he going to use history? Maybe. Maybe. Because we have a history in the United States that makes us unique from any other country. And if you don't understand your constituents, the people that put you in office, and why they feel the way they feel, you're not going to get elected. Well, he rises in government. He becomes an ambassador to China. He becomes the CIA chief. And what's he do? He gathers information. And the more information he gathers, the more he has to sift through it to decide what's going to be good for America and what's not. Now, during this time that he's rising in all these positions, there's a nasty little war going on in a faraway place called Vietnam that most Americans have never even heard about. And their sons are being sent over in the hundreds of thousands. And they're dying there. They're dying there to protect democratic principles. Or so they're told. Had they only studied history, they would have known that the Vietnamese people have been subjugated by many different people, and they never stopped fighting. It didn't matter if the Chinese subjugated them, if the Japanese subjugated them. It didn't matter if the next-door neighbor Thais subjugated them. They continued to fight. They did the same thing to the French, and what made our government officials think that things were going to be different? They ignored the lessons of history. And little George Bush, who was in that boat and knew war firsthand, who was the head of the CIA and gathered all that information in, he becomes the President of the United States. He is the man that decides whether there's going to be war or peace in the world. And war comes when George Bush is president. The Gulf War. What does George do? Does he get us locked in a land battle that is going to last forever, that's going to suck in hundreds of thousands of young men in a war that's going to last 13 years? No. He knows history. He knows the Americans. The Americans see a job, they go in, they do it, and they come home. No garrison troops. George Bush understood history. George Bush also understood the American people. And because of that, he used history to make a wise decision. You're going to be able to use history to elect wise men who will be in this country and will be your next president. We have other presidents that are going to come into office. Bill Clinton, he understood history, and his advisors did too. Little place called Bosnia-Herzegovina, Yugoslavia. You know, that war has been going on since the Ottoman Turks took that power way back in the 1460s. It's been going on, feuding back and forth. He understood history. He knew if he put in ground troops, they were going to get ground up and people were going to die. So that brings us back to this class we've got here today. Today we're going to learn about the beginnings of civilization. But I'm not going to do it in this coat and tie. I'm going to put on a costume. And I'm going to be right back. Professor Thompson here. Today we're going to be discovering what is civilization. Civilization can be 5 things. Cities, advanced technology, specialized workers, institutions, and writing. All of those things melded together with one group brings a civilization to the forefront. And today's civilization that we're going to be talking about begins in the Fertile Crescent. The area of the Fertile Crescent includes Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel. But let's get something out of the way first. I like to call it the dating game. Dates. Way back in time, especially ancient dates. Why do people come up with these dates? Well, let me tell you. Scholars like myself do a little research, do a little digging perhaps, a little archaeological work, and then we make estimations. We think, I think this person may have lived 2,000 years ago. Well, what makes you think that? Well, because it was underneath the one that we thought lived 1,700 years ago. Oh, good idea. This is how the dating game works. People make estimations. They try to get the facts. And when a new piece of evidence comes in, they may change history and rewrite it. And that's exactly what happened in the area called Mesopotamia. The land between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. You see, it's a very funny thing. We didn't know these people really existed with a civilization. We thought it was just nomadic tribes that existed during this time period of 3,500 BC. Well, we had a book to go by. It was a book called the Old Testament. Talked about people that lived in the area. We didn't know a civilization grew up there. We knew about other civilizations. We knew about the Nile civilization, Egypt. 3,100 BC, when it came about. We knew about the Indus River, the civilization of India. We knew it was about 2,500 BC. And the Chinese civilization, about 1,700 BC. But the one in Mesopotamia, it was a mystery. And we'll get to that. The river, Tigris and Euphrates, flows. And as it flows, it does certain things to help make a civilization grow. You've got to have a food supply. You've got to have a reason for people coming to a place. And that's what this provided. The silt from the river, when it overflowed, would make the fields fertile around it. In addition to that, there were the marshes, swampy areas where waterfowl, birds, fish would live. A constant food supply living there near the water. Absolutely necessary for civilization to begin. The first civilization was called Sumer. Sumer. And like I said, we didn't know they existed. 1835 it was. British officer. A place called the Rock Epihistan. Big rock face covered with writing in 3 separate styles. Had to mean something. Huge relief up there it was. He decided he was going to translate it. After all, that French fellow did the thing with the hieroglyphics in Egypt. Why couldn't he? Well, the problem was it was a little bit larger than the Rosetta Stone. It was huge. And it was life-threatening just to get to it. You had to throw ropes up and climb up and try to read the darn thing and copy it down. Even hired a boy, a local boy, to go up there and try to figure it out and write them all down and drop the notes down to him. For years he worked on it. And at last he broke the code. And just like that, we knew that these people existed as a civilization. They had writing, remember. But it wasn't until 1877 when more archaeological digs uncovered more of this civilization called Sumer that the history books began to be rewritten. No more were they just nomads. Now we have a civilization. It was a city-state. And in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, city-states began to dot all over. Independent of each other, with their own kings and leaders, villages first formed. For safety, for food, for trade. They grew larger. We believe that perhaps they were democratically elected leaders at that time, and then war came. And war means you've got to have a leader that makes decisions now and will be obeyed now. Because if you wait, your little beginnings of a civilization can be wiped out. So kings came into power of these city-states. And so now a city is born. The first step to a civilization. Technology is next. The simple things such as the wheel are invented in Sumer. Some civilizations never really quite got around to inventing the wheel. The ancient Americans had the wheel. We found little toys, but no evidence they had huge carts or anything like that. But the wheel is invented. In addition to the wheel, the sailboat. Instead of having to row or pole your way through the marshes, the wind would billow in your sails and carry you away. The plow was invented instead of a stick. A great technological marvel. We also have the Bronze Age entering in, where copper and tin are mixed together to make a superior metal for weapons and tools. They had specialized workers. They had artisans, potters, weavers, scholars, teachers, whole civilization, institutions. And by that I mean two types, government and religion. The government, the first king was called the Big Man. Like I said, he was probably elected. When war came along, they appointed the king and probably became hereditary at that point. The people of Sumer had the first formal government with laws and officials in the history of the world. Religion, they were polytheistic, meaning they believed in many gods. Each city had its own set of gods, an own set of beliefs. There were private deities for each family even. They had priest kings. The king and the priest were all one and the same, in charge of the religion. And they built a strange structure called ziggurats. Rectangular buildings, piled one on top of each other. Some people have thought that perhaps they built these huge mountains of clay, ziggurats, because the nomads who settled there longed for the mountains. Others thought, well, perhaps it was because the Tigris-Euphrates River keeps overflowing its banks. It's to keep at least the king high and dry. We don't really know why they built them, but they were part of their religious services. Their beliefs. On was the god of heaven. Enlil was the chief god, the god of the air. Enki was the water god. And Ninhursag was the earth mother. They believed in what was called Meh. Meh was the individual laws governing the universe that not even the gods could break. They had human-like gods, human frailties in their gods. Their chief of the gods, Enlil, decides one day that he has a special desire for a young goddess, and so he attacks and rapes her. He broke the Meh, the individual laws governing the universe, and he is punished. He is sent away to the nether world. See, there's three parts of our universe. There is the heavens in a huge dome with like the stars painted around it. There is the earth where we live now, and under us is the nether world, a rather lifeless and dull and boring place, the afterlife. It exists. People were taught that man came about made of the clay and blood of the slain gods. We were taught not to complain, not to moan and complain to God, not to argue with God. Personal gods. They would protect us and they would assist us. And they used to make little statues of them. And we were all going to be judged by the sun god Utu. They also had the story of the flood, where the world is going to be destroyed by water. Writing. They started with pictographs. You know, if you were going to draw the head of a cow, you'd give it two horns, I'm sure, and a face. And that's what they did. And gradually, around 3000 BC, they had over 2,000 separate symbols in their writing. And they would write upon clay tablets. Then they changed and got it down to 600. It's called cuneiform. Cuneus, Latin for wedge. It was all wedge-shaped. They would literally cut a reed and use it to imprint into the wet clay. They would not fire the clay, but leave it wet. It would dry, but much more difficult to preserve. And we have dug up hundreds of these things nowadays. But you have to be very careful. They're very fragile. The city-states were weakened by war. Nomads coming in, weakened, fighting one another, until at last the nomads succeed and take over the cities. But the cities have a way of absorbing nomads. They see a superior lifestyle, and they begin to copy it. And so the Amorites, they came in 2000 BC and took over the city of Babylon. The gate of the gods is what the city means. And they expand, the Amorites do, that one city-state into an empire. And it covers all of Mesopotamia. The first empire in the history of the world. And their great king, Hammurabi. Now, other people had written down laws before, but Hammurabi's something special. He writes his laws down, 282 laws from Hammurabi, dealing with three different subjects. The first one is witches. What to do with a witch? First whole bunch of laws. Because this is a time of demons, a time of witchcraft. You've got to know how to deal with witches and witchcraft. Second area, crimes. Murder, stealing, usually punishable by death. Trade. Let's say a man builds a balcony for you and it collapses and it kills your son. What are you going to do? Sue? No. The man who built it's put to death. Trade laws. And the very last thing was a curse, saying the terrible things that would happen to you if you didn't obey the law. Hammurabi's laws became the building blocks for the other civilizations that would arise throughout the area. 200 years, his empire sticks around. It at last falls. But other little places begin to have civilizations and cropping up. The Phoenicians, modern-day Lebanon, city-state, arises. These men are sailors. These men are traders. These men don't have a whole lot, and therefore they've got to make use with what they've got. And what they do have are little tiny snails all over their beaches. Now, what are you going to do with little tiny snails all over your beaches? Well, what they're going to do is get 60,000 of them, open them up, and oh so gingerly squeeze out their glands. It makes a beautiful purple dye. 60,000 glands equals 1 pound of purple dye, which makes an incredibly expensive process to make the color purple, which was why the kings were the only ones who could afford it, which is why purple represents kings. These were the men of Lebanon who sent ships out into the Mediterranean, who colonized places like Carthage, who would later challenge Rome. Even to Spain and around the islands, these people had their colonies set up. In 900 BC, they produce a 22-letter alphabet in a writing system. Our alphabet is named after Aleph and Beth, alphabet. Their first 2 letters of their alphabet. And we get that writing directly into our system of simplified writing. The next group was the only group we really could identify before, the Hebrews, the Jews. We had a book, the Old Testament, that told us about them. We knew they existed. We knew they were nomads. Abraham came from the city of Ur, one of the city-states in the Tigris-Euphrates area. He wandered about. He had a son Isaac. He had a son Jacob. Changes his name to Israel. He has 12 sons. One of them is Judah, the Jews come from that tribe. They go to Egypt because there's a famine. And one of the 12 sons of Israel is there. His name is Joseph, and he has become second only to the Pharaoh. It's a story right there in Genesis. You can read it. And he invites his family there, and they live. And then there arises a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, and his people become the slaves of the Egyptians. Moses arises out of them to lead them back to their promised land. He is the lawgiver. He not only gives us the 10 Commandments, which includes thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, and all the rest, but hundreds of other laws as well contained in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. He is the lawgiver. Then we come to the first really wise empire, a tolerant empire, an empire built on some principles that will make it last a little bit longer than most. That empire is the empire of the Persians. Now, Cyrus is their king, and he sweeps out of Persia to conquer a huge empire. He's militarily strong. The city of Babylon itself opens its gates to him rather than be attacked. And he enters triumphantly. A later successor, Darius, takes over. Often called Darius. He is wise. He appoints governors called satraps to rule each individual area with separate autonomy, and the people can pretty much keep business the way it was. He's not going to force a religion down your throat. He'll allow you to practice whatever religion it is you've got. The Persians are the same people that returned the Jews who had been captured by the Babylonians to their own homeland again and allow them to build their temple. Wise and tolerant. He puts out a road system that goes all over so he can have quick communications and standardized coins. A money for the entire empire. Then comes Zoroastrianism. Zoroaster was a prophet, a holy man. And with the support of Darius, he's going to push his religion. There are 2 great forces in the world, good and evil. And if you're good, you're going to go to heaven. And if you're evil, you're going to go to hell. There's going to be a judgment. And Darius liked this religion. He liked it because it taught absolutes. It was something that could unify his whole kingdom. And so, with official support, Zoroastrianism begins to grow in power. I'm aware today you don't hear too much of Zoroastrianism. But during its time, it was a thriving and vibrant religion. And so what have we learned? We've learned about the civilizations that have arisen out of the Fertile Crescent. That there are 5 things that make up a civilization. Going from villages to cities, advanced technologies, specialized workers, institutions which include government and religion, and last of all, writing, so that we can communicate. And so now history has gotten a start in this portion of the world. And remember, this history is a recent development. Prior to 1877, we didn't know the people of Sumer even existed. Who knows what things we might learn next week or next year that will open the scholarly mind to even more exciting things. But that will be for another day, another lecture about the ancient world.